The morning they told Vera Calloway she had 30 days to leave the house she had lived in for 43 years, the magnolias outside the kitchen window were in full bloom. She noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice the most ordinary things at the moment everything else falls apart. The white petals heavy and perfect against the gray February sky, indifferent to what was happening on the other side of the glass. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 74 years old. She was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug she had owned since 1989, a wide ceramic thing with a small chip on the rim that she had always meant to throw away and never did. Her daughter-in-law, Renata, sat across from her with a folder of papers and the careful expression of a woman who had rehearsed this conversation more than once. Her son, Douglas, stood near the doorway with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the floor. They did not look at her when they told her. Douglas said the estate attorney had reviewed everything. He said it with the particular flatness of someone repeating language that had been handed to them by someone else, language they understood well enough to deliver, but not well enough to feel. He said that the house, under the terms of his father's will as currently structured, and given certain arrangements made during the final months of Raymond's illness, would need to be transferred. He said the word transferred as though it were a neutral, administrative term, as though it referred to a document being moved between filing cabinets rather than a woman being removed from the only home she had ever fully belonged to. Renata slid the folder across the table. Her fingernails were a pale shell pink, recently done. Vera watched them rather than reading the papers. 30 days, Douglas said, still looking at the floor. Vera did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who have already made a decision does nothing except give them the uncomfortable feeling of having caused something, which sometimes leads them to comfort you, which can feel like kindness, but is usually just a way of making themselves feel better about the thing they have already done. She kept her hands on the mug. She looked at the folder without opening it. She said she understood. After they left, she sat alone in the kitchen until the coffee went cold and the light through the window shifted from morning gray to afternoon gray without much changing between them. The magnolias kept blooming. The house made its small familiar sounds, the tick of the baseboard heat, the soft complaint of the second stair when the temperature dropped, the particular creak of the back door settling into its frame that she had been meaning to tell someone about for years and now would not need to. Raymond Calloway had died 14 months ago, in the small hours of a November morning, quietly and without ceremony, which was very much like him. He had been a man of deliberate silences and careful distances, not cold exactly, but measured in a way that had sometimes made Vera feel that she was reaching across a space that he had decided, long before she arrived, should remain exactly that wide. They had been married for 46 years. It was, by most external measures, a long and successful marriage. They had raised Douglas together. They had built a home and maintained it. They had attended the same church for 30 years and gone to the same hardware store on Saturday mornings and shared a bed and a table and the accumulated furniture of a life without any dramatic ruptures. What they had not shared, as it turned out, was information. Raymond had been a man who handled things. That was the phrase Douglas used when, in the months after his father's death, certain financial realities had begun to surface with the particular unpleasantness of things that have been submerged for a long time. Your father handled things, Douglas had told her, as though handling was its own kind of virtue, regardless of what had been done with the things being handled. Raymond had restructured. Raymond had made decisions. Raymond had, in his final year, when the diagnosis had arrived and the timeline had become something he needed to reckon with, made additional arrangements that his attorney had apparently considered entirely appropriate and entirely legal, and that had resulted, through a series of mechanisms Vera could not entirely follow when Douglas tried to explain them, in the house no longer being hers. There was a smaller property, Douglas said, a rental unit in the next county that could generate some income. There were accounts that had been restructured for estate purposes. There was a modest monthly sum that would come to her, enough to live on if she was careful. He said, if she was careful, as though she had been anything else her entire life. She had been careful. She had been careful for 46 years, and before that for the 28 years that preceded Raymond. Careful with money, and careful with feelings, and careful with the enormous invisible labor of keeping things intact, The kind of careful that nobody ever counts because it never appears on a balance sheet or gets discussed by estate attorneys or ends up in any folder with a shell-pink fingernail sliding it across a table. She had been careful, and it had not protected her from anything. What Douglas and Renata did not know, because they had not asked and she had not said and Raymond had never mentioned it in any conversation she had ever been part of, was that Raymond had left her one more thing. Not in his will, not in any legal document his attorney had reviewed or any arrangement that appeared on the paperwork Renata had slid across the kitchen table with such practiced quiet. He had left it in an envelope. She had found it 6 weeks after his death, during one of the long and slightly dissociative afternoons she had spent going through his study, sorting the accumulated paper of a careful man's lifetime into piles that meant keep and discard, and I don't know what to do with this. The envelope had been at the back of the middle desk drawer, beneath a road atlas from 2004 and a small collection of rubber bands that had gone brittle and snapped when she touched them. Her name was written on the front in Raymond's handwriting, which had always been neater than she expected from a man with such large hands. Inside was a single key and a folded note. The note said, "Vera, I should have shown you this long ago. I know that. On the far edge of the Aldermoor property, past the east fence line, there is a greenhouse. The key fits the padlock. It has been locked since before we married. I was never sure I had the right to open it. I think maybe you do. I am sorry for more than I knew how to say while I was here. The Aldermoor property was 12 acres of land that Raymond had inherited from his own mother, Margaret Calloway, who had died in 1987. It sat about 14 miles outside of town, a mostly wooded parcel with a meadow at the center and a creek along the southern boundary. Raymond had never farmed it, never developed it, had barely spoken of it in all the years Vera had known him. He paid the property taxes on it every year without complaint, and otherwise seemed to regard it as something he held in trust for reasons he had not entirely articulated even to himself. When Douglas had gone through the estate, the Aldermoor land had been noted and inventoried and assigned a value that made Douglas briefly interested, and then, when he learned what undeveloped land in that county actually sold for, considerably less so. No one had mentioned a greenhouse. Vera had kept the key and the note in the pocket of her winter coat for 3 months. She had taken it out and looked at it on several occasions. She had thought about telling Douglas and decided against it for reasons she could not entirely name, except that the note felt private in a way that the rest of Raymond's estate did not. Raymond had written her name on it. He had said "I am sorry" in a way he had never managed to say while he was alive. Whatever was on the other side of that padlock had been left to her by a man who had not been able to give her very much while he was present, and she was not prepared to hand it over to an estate attorney before she had even seen it. She had been going to go in the spring. Spring had arrived faster than she was ready for it, in the specific form of a 30-day notice and a folder with shell-pink fingernails and the magnolias blooming outside the kitchen window of a house that was no longer hers. She went in March instead. The drive to the Aldermoor property took 22 minutes on a Tuesday morning, down a county road that ran through second-growth forest and past 2 farms that were operational and one that wasn't anymore. Vera drove Raymond's old truck, which Douglas had told her she could keep for now, as though keeping something for now was a category of possession she should be grateful for. She had packed a canvas bag with a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, her good work gloves, and the kind of practical anxiety that comes from being a woman of 74 who is doing something she has not told anyone she is doing. The access road to the Aldermoor property was unpaved, a rutted track through a corridor of bare-branched trees that had not been traveled recently enough to be smooth. The truck moved through it slowly, and Vera kept both hands on the wheel and did not think too carefully about what she was driving toward, because she had learned in 74 years that thinking too carefully about uncertain things before you arrive at them uses up exactly the courage you will need when you get there. The meadow opened up on the other side of the tree line in the flat gray light of a March morning, broader than she remembered from the one time Raymond had brought her out here, years ago, before Douglas was born. The grass was winter pale and flattened, and the creek was audible before it was visible, a cold and steady sound from somewhere beyond the tree line to the south. There was a fence, weathered cedar posts and rusted wire, running along the east perimeter of the meadow. She parked and got out and stood for a moment in the cold air with her hands in her jacket pockets. Raymond had said past the east fence line. She walked the fence until it bent, following the property line into a denser stand of trees that she had not noticed from the meadow. The ground sloped slightly here, and the leaf litter was deep and soft from years of accumulation, the kind of forest floor that has not been walked in long enough to lose the memory of footsteps. She moved through it carefully, watching her footing, her breath making small clouds in the cold. She almost missed it. The greenhouse was set back from the fence line by perhaps 30 feet, in a natural clearing that the trees had grown around rather than over, as though they had learned over decades to maintain a respectful distance from whatever was inside. It was larger than she had imagined from Raymond's note. Glass and iron, Victorian in its bones, the kind of structure that was built in an era when greenhouses were considered permanent rather than seasonal, when iron was used because it was meant to last rather than because it was cheap. Many of the glass panes were intact. Several were cracked. A few had broken entirely and been replaced at some point, long ago, with panels of a slightly different glass that did not quite match the original. Moss had colonized the iron framework in green-gray patches. Vines had wrapped themselves around the lower sections of the structure with the patient authority of plants that have had years to establish their claim. The door was iron too, set in an arched frame, with a padlock through a heavy latch. The padlock was rusted the color of old blood, roughened by decades of weather, but it had a solidity to it, the solidity of good iron rather than cheap iron, and when Vera slid the key in and turned it, the mechanism moved with a resistance that gave and then released in a way that felt, for a reason she could not entirely account for, like something had been waiting. The door swung inward. The smell that came out first was green. Old green, layered and complex. The smell of living things and their decompositions layered over each other across what must have been a very long time. Underneath it was iron and old wood, and something fainter and harder to name. Something dry and papery that she would later understand as the accumulated years of a sealed space holding on to its own history. She stepped inside. The interior was larger than the exterior had suggested. The structure extended back perhaps 60 feet from the door, with a central aisle flanked on both sides by long iron staging tables at waist height. Above her, the glass vaulted upward in the way that old greenhouses do, creating a sense of vertical space that the horizontal dimensions of the structure did not quite account for. The light inside was diffuse and gray-green, filtered through the moss and the grime on the glass panes, and it fell across everything with a quality that was not quite real, the quality of light in an aquarium or a dream. What she saw in that light stopped her walking entirely. The greenhouse was not empty. It was not abandoned in the way she had been half expecting, not stripped and bare and hollowed by years of disuse. The staging tables were covered, not randomly, not carelessly, but with the organized density of a working space, a space that had been in active and serious use before it was sealed. Orchids, hundreds of them, or what had been orchids, in pots still sitting in their places on the staging tables, their roots alive in the bark medium, their leaves leathery and reduced, but green in the places the diffuse light reached. Vera moved closer and looked at one, then another. Then she understood what she was looking at. They had not died. Some of them had. The ones along the north wall, where a section of glass had given entirely to a crack that had widened over years, letting in the cold, those were gone. But the majority, the ones in the warmer interior sections, the ones sheltered by the mass of the structure itself from the worst of the winter temperatures, had done something that orchids in the right circumstances do. They had gone dormant. They had pulled back to their roots and their pseudobulbs and waited with the patient indifference of organisms that do not experience time the way animals do, that do not feel the urgency of passing years because urgency requires a nervous system that plants do not possess. They had simply waited. Vera stood in the middle of the greenhouse with her canvas bag over her shoulder and her breath making small clouds in the cold interior air and looked at hundreds of orchids that had been sealed inside this structure for what the moss on the iron framework and the depth of the vine colonization and the particular quality of the accumulated decades told her was a very long time. Long enough that she had never known they were here. Long enough that Raymond, who had inherited the land in 1987, had apparently known they were here and had never mentioned them to her. Long enough that whatever the story was behind this place, it was not a short one. She found the workbench at the far end of the greenhouse, along the south wall where the light was best. It was a long wooden surface, stained with the evidence of decades of work, old soil and watermarks, and the pale rings of pot bases arranged and rearranged over years. Above it, mounted on the iron framework of the wall, were wooden shelves holding clay pots in graduated sizes, coils of wire, paper labels still in their original box, tools she recognized and tools she did not. Below the workbench, a series of drawers with small ceramic pulls, the kind that come on furniture from another era. She opened the first drawer. Inside, in the flat gray-green light of that sealed and waiting place, she found notebooks. They were stacked in the drawer with the same care that everything else in this greenhouse had been organized, the same deliberate attention that the staging tables and the labeled shelves and the graduated pot sizes all spoke to. 6 notebooks, composition style, their covers aged to a soft brown, their spines intact. She lifted the top one and opened it. The handwriting inside was small and precise and feminine, the handwriting of a woman who wrote as a daily practice rather than an occasional necessity. The first page said simply, in the top right corner, Margaret Calloway, 1962. Vera stood holding the notebook for a long moment. The cold of the greenhouse was working through her jacket in a way she had not noticed until now. Her hands were not quite steady. Raymond's mother. Raymond's mother had built this greenhouse, or had been given it, or had found it. Raymond's mother had filled it with orchids and had worked in it, and had kept notebooks about that work going back to 1962, 25 years before Raymond inherited the land. And Raymond had inherited the land and the greenhouse along with it, and had locked the door and kept the key and had never once in 46 years of marriage mentioned any of it to the woman he had married. She did not yet understand why, but she was beginning to understand that the answer was somewhere in this building, waiting for her in the same patient way the orchids had been waiting, the way things wait when they have no other choice but do not intend to give up. She put the notebook in her canvas bag. Then she put the rest of them in too, carefully, one by one. She looked around at the greenhouse, at the hundreds of dormant orchids on their staging tables, at the organized tools and the labeled shelves and the pale winter light coming through the moss-covered glass. She was 74 years old. She had 30 days to leave the only home she had known for 43 years. She had $11.40 in her personal checking account at that exact moment, which she knew because she had checked that morning with the specific compulsiveness of a person who is frightened about money and cannot stop themselves from measuring the thing that frightens them. She had a key that worked. She had notebooks written by a dead woman who had apparently spent decades building something extraordinary in a sealed greenhouse that no one alive had known about. She closed the greenhouse door behind her and walked back through the leaf litter to the truck in the March cold, and she sat in the cab for a few minutes with the heat running and her hands still not entirely steady and the canvas bag with the notebooks on the seat beside her. Then she drove back to the house on the Aldermoor property that was, technically, still part of Raymond's estate, and which Douglas had not yet decided what to do with, and which was a small and unloved farmhouse that had not been properly lived in since Margaret Calloway stopped coming out here, and which had, as far as Vera could tell when she walked through it that afternoon, good bones and a sound roof and windows that, if you replaced the cracked ones, would let in a great deal of light. She sat at the kitchen table of that unloved farmhouse with the notebooks spread open in front of her and a cup of the thermos coffee going cold in her hand, and she began to read. Margaret Calloway had been, as it turned out, something more than a woman who kept a greenhouse. The notebooks made that clear within the first 30 pages of the first volume. The handwriting was dense with the particular kind of detail that comes from a person recording things they need to remember, measurements and observations and cross-references to other notebooks and dates that tracked not weeks, but years of work. Margaret had been cultivating orchids since before she acquired the Aldermoor land, had brought specimens with her from somewhere that the first notebook referred to only as the original collection without further explanation, as though she assumed the reader of these notes would already know what that meant. What she had been doing with those orchids, Vera understood gradually as she moved through the second notebook and then the third, was not merely gardening. It was hybridization. Systematic, documented, methodical hybridization, the deliberate crossing of species to produce new varieties, the kind of work that required botanical knowledge, patience, precise record-keeping, and a timescale measured in years rather than seasons. Margaret had been creating new orchid varieties, had been documenting them with the exactness of a scientist, had recorded germination dates and cross-pollination records, and the particular characteristics of each successive generation with a completeness that made Vera think of the word archives before she thought of the word garden. The later notebooks contained photographs, small black and white prints pressed between pages, labeled in Margaret's handwriting. Flowers that were unlike anything Vera had seen in any garden catalog, unusual color combinations, and petal configurations that had the look of something that had never existed before the specific crossing that produced them. The final notebook was dated 1981. It ended mid-sentence, in a way that was not planned. Vera read the last page 3 times. Margaret Calloway had died in 1982. Raymond had inherited the land 5 years later, when it finally cleared probate. He had found the greenhouse. He had locked it. He had kept it locked for 37 years and had never told Vera it existed. And the only thing he had said about it in the end was that he had not been sure he had the right to open it, and that maybe she did. She stayed in the farmhouse until the light outside changed from afternoon to early evening. She could hear the creak from the window above the kitchen sink, a steady and indifferent sound. When she finally got up to go, she stood in the small front room and looked at the space with an attention that was not assessment exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that was trying to understand what she was looking at without committing to any particular conclusion about what it meant. She drove home in the dark with the notebooks on the seat beside her. She did not call Douglas. She read through the night. Not all 6 notebooks, not in a single sitting, but enough. Enough to understand the shape of what Margaret Calloway had spent 20 years building in that greenhouse. Enough to feel the specific weight of something that had been locked away and waiting. Enough to reach the last written page of the final notebook and sit for a long time in the kitchen of her own house, the house she had 30 days left in, with her hands flat on the table and her coffee cold and the particular silence of 3 in the morning pressing against the windows. Margaret had not been an amateur. That was the thing that kept asserting itself through the botanical language and the careful measurements and the cross-reference specimen numbers. The notebooks read like the records of someone formally trained, someone who had learned the discipline of documentation from a source that took documentation seriously. There were references in the margins of the early volumes to correspondence with a botanical institution, a university extension program in a city 3 states away, the kind of oblique references that suggested an ongoing professional relationship rather than a hobby pursued in isolation. In the 4th notebook, dated 1974, there was a folded letter pressed between 2 pages. It was from the American Orchid Society. It was addressed to Margaret Calloway at the Aldermoor address. It was a response to what it described as your submission of specimens and documentation for the 1974 registration cycle. The language of the letter was formal and precise, and Vera read it twice to be sure she understood it correctly. The Society was confirming the registration of 3 new hybrid varieties under Margaret Calloway's name as the originating hybridizer. The varieties were listed by their registration numbers and their given names, names Margaret had chosen herself. The letter expressed the Society's appreciation for the quality of the documentation submitted and noted that the specimens were among the most clearly differentiated new varieties received that registration year. Vera set the letter down on the kitchen table. She picked it up again. She read the names of the 3 registered varieties one more time. Then she went to the computer Douglas had helped her set up 3 years ago and had shown her how to use for email and for looking things up, and she typed the name of the American Orchid Society into the search bar, and then she typed in the first of the 3 variety names from the letter. It was there. On a database maintained by the Society, a searchable registry of hybrid orchid varieties going back decades, there was an entry for the variety Margaret had named. Registered 1974. Hybridizer, Margaret E. Calloway. Status, active registration. She typed in the second name. Also there. Registered 1976. She typed in the third. Registered 1977. Vera sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her kitchen. The kitchen she had painted twice and repainted once and had stood in making breakfast for 43 years, and thought about a woman she had never met who had spent 2 decades in a locked greenhouse creating things that had her name on them in an official registry and who had died before anyone in her family, apparently, had understood what she was leaving behind. She thought about Raymond, who had known the greenhouse was there and had locked it and kept the key for 37 years. She thought about the notebooks, 6 of them, dense with the record of 20 years of work. She thought about the orchids, hundreds of them, still alive in the cold and the dark. She did not sleep that night. The first person she called in the morning was not Douglas. It was Helen Marsh, who had been her closest friend for 30 years and who answered the phone at 7:15 with the alert readiness of a woman who has always been an early riser and who asked no unnecessary questions when Vera said she needed to talk about something and could she come over. Helen Marsh was 71, recently widowed herself, with a background in landscape design that had shaded over the years into a serious and well-informed interest in ornamental horticulture. She had a greenhouse of her own, a smaller one, attached to the back of her house, and she knew enough about orchids to know what she did not know, which was a specific and useful kind of knowledge. Vera showed her the notebooks. She showed her the letter from the American Orchid Society. She showed her the registry entries she had found on the computer. Helen sat at the kitchen table and read, without speaking, for 40 minutes. When she finally looked up, her expression was the careful expression of someone choosing their words with a deliberateness that meant the words mattered. "Vera," she said, "do you have any idea what registered orchid hybrids sell for?" Vera said she did not. Helen was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I think you need to go back to that greenhouse today, and I think I should come with you." They drove out to the Aldermoor property together in Helen's car, with the notebooks in a bag on the back seat. The March morning was clearer than the day before, a thin winter sun cutting through the bare branches and laying pale strips of light across the road. Helen did not fill the drive with conversation, which was one of the things Vera had always valued about her. She understood that silence was sometimes more useful than words. The greenhouse, seen a second time, looked different. Vera had half expected it to seem smaller, the way things often do when the initial shock of discovery has passed and the ordinary light of a subsequent day falls on them. It did not seem smaller. It seemed, if anything, more substantial, more deliberate in its architecture, more clearly the work of someone who had intended it to last. Helen stood in the doorway for a moment after Vera unlocked it. She did not say anything. She walked in slowly, the way Vera had walked in the day before, and she moved along the staging tables with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at the orchids without touching them. She stopped at several and leaned close. She straightened and kept walking. At the workbench at the far end, she stopped and looked at the labeled shelves and the graduated pot sizes and the organized tools for a long time. Then she turned around and looked at Vera. "Some of these are the registered varieties," she said. "The ones from the notebooks. I recognize the registration names on 2 of the label stakes." She paused. "Vera, if these plants are what I think they are, if they are the original stock of registered hybrids with documented provenance going back to the hybridizer, the value is not what you would pay for an orchid at a garden center." Vera waited. "Collectors pay for provenance," Helen said. "They pay for rarity. They pay for documented lineage. And registered hybrids with this level of documentation, originating from the hybridizer's own collection, with 40 years of continuous survival history, those are not common. Those are not common at all." Vera looked at the orchids on the tables, the hundreds of pots with their leathery, reduced leaves and their patient roots. "How much?" she said. Helen shook her head slightly, not dismissively, but honestly. "I don't know enough to tell you a number, but I know someone who might." His name was Patrick Garrity, and he drove down from the city on a Saturday 2 weeks later in a silver car that was too clean for the unpaved access road, and that he did not seem particularly concerned about. He was 68 years old, compact and precise in his movements, with the unhurried manner of a man who has spent a significant portion of his life in places where patience was required. He had been a collector of rare orchids for 30 years and had consulted for auction houses and estates on valuation. Helen had known him peripherally through a horticultural association and had called him on a Wednesday and had apparently described what she had seen in enough detail that he had rearranged his weekend to come. He spent 4 hours in the greenhouse. He brought a loupe and a camera and a battered notebook of his own, and he moved through the space with a methodical attention that reminded Vera of the way a doctor moves through an examination, systematic and focused, and withholding conclusion until the evidence was complete. He photographed the plants. He photographed the label stakes. He asked Vera for the notebooks and spent an hour reading at the workbench while she and Helen sat outside on a fallen log in the weak March sun and drank coffee from Helen's thermos and did not talk very much. When he came out, he stood in the clearing for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the greenhouse from the outside. Then he said, "Mrs. Calloway, I want to be precise with you because I think you deserve precision rather than enthusiasm. I am looking at one of the most significant private orchid collections I have encountered in 30 years of this work. The provenance documentation in those notebooks is extraordinary." Margaret Calloway was a serious hybridizer. Her registered varieties are known in collecting circles. The fact that original stock plants from her collection survived is, frankly, remarkable and is the kind of thing that does not happen very often. Vera said, "And the value?" He named a range. She made him repeat it. He repeated it, and the range he gave was not the kind of range that changes the arithmetic of a small problem. It was the kind of range that changes the arithmetic of an entire life. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She stood in the clearing outside the greenhouse where Raymond's mother had spent 20 years building something that Raymond had locked away and that Douglas and Renata had not known to look for, and she listened to Patrick Garrity tell her what that something was worth, and she felt a feeling she did not have a clean word for. It was not joy exactly. Joy is too light a word for something that is also grief, that is also the very precise awareness of all the years that passed while this sat locked and waiting. While she scrubbed the kitchen table she would never own again, while she was careful, while she made herself small enough to fit inside a life that had been, she understood now, only a partial account of what was available to her. She said she would need some time to think. Patrick Garrity said he understood completely and gave her his card and said he was available whenever she was ready. That evening, back at the house, she called Douglas. She did not tell him about the collection. She told him she was going to need more than 30 days. That she had found something on the Aldermoor property that required her attention and that she would be moving out there while she sorted through it. Douglas said the farmhouse on the Aldermoor property was technically part of the estate and that she should not be making any changes to it without consulting him first. Vera said she understood and that she would let him know when she had a clearer picture of the situation. She said it in the flat and pleasant voice of a woman who has decided something and is not asking for permission and is not going to argue about it either. Douglas told her to keep him informed. He said it with the slight edge of a man who suspects he is not being told everything and who does not yet know what to do with that suspicion. Vera said good night and hung up and began packing. She moved to the Aldermoor farmhouse on a Thursday in late March, in 2 trips with Raymond's truck. She took her clothing and her books and the kitchen things she had brought into the marriage herself, the wide ceramic mug with the chip on the rim, the cast-iron pan she had owned since before Douglas was born, the set of knives that had been a wedding gift from Helen 30 years ago. She took the notebooks. She took the framed photograph from the bedroom, the one of herself and Raymond in the early years, taken at the property of a friend during a summer evening when they had both been briefly, genuinely happy in each other's company in a way that was not complicated by anything else yet. She left the magnolia tree and everything else. The farmhouse was cold when she arrived. The cold of a place that had not had a fire in it for a long time, and it smelled of old wood and the particular closed-in quality of a space that has been holding its breath. She opened the windows in the front room despite the cold because the smell needed somewhere to go, and she started a fire in the wood stove with the wood she had picked up from a gas station on the way out, and she stood in front of it until her hands were warm. Then she put the kettle on the one working burner of the old gas range and got to work. The farmhouse had not been maintained with any seriousness in years. The floors were sound but dirty, the kind of deep-ground dirt that requires something more than a mop. 2 of the windows in the back bedroom were cracked, and one in the kitchen let in a draft along its lower sill that she stuffed with a folded dish towel as a temporary measure. The bathroom needed work she could see at a glance would require someone who knew what they were doing. The wood stove drew well, which mattered more than almost anything else in March, and the roof, when she went out and looked at it from the yard, showed no obvious signs of failure. She cleaned for 3 days. Not the cleaning of someone making a temporary arrangement comfortable, but the cleaning of someone who intends to stay. She got on her hands and knees on the floors with a scrub brush. She washed the windows until the light came through them differently. She took everything out of the kitchen cabinets and washed the shelves and put things back in the places that made sense for how she cooked rather than in the places someone else had left them. On the 4th day, she walked to the greenhouse. She went every morning after that. The weather in late March was variable and cold, and twice there was a late frost that she worried about. But the greenhouse structure, even with its cracked panes, maintained enough residual warmth from the southern glass exposure that the interior temperature did not drop to a damaging level on either night. The orchids were beginning to respond to the lengthening days. She could see it in the small signs that the notebooks had taught her to look for: the swelling of growth nodes, the first tentative emergence of new root tips at the edges of the bark medium, the almost imperceptible brightening of the leathery leaves as the plants recognized that the season was changing. She learned from the notebooks the way she had once learned from textbooks, with the focused attention of someone who needs the information to be real rather than theoretical. Margaret's records were dense but clear, the clarity of someone who wrote to be understood by a future reader rather than merely to record. The cultivation requirements were specific. Certain varieties needed this temperature range, that light level, this watering frequency. The hybridization records were more complex, but followed a logic that Vera found she could follow if she went slowly and cross-referenced between volumes. She made her own notes alongside Margaret's. A second layer of handwriting in a different pen, the conversation between two women who had never met, conducted across 40 years and through the medium of 6 composition notebooks. Helen came out on weekends. She had enough practical knowledge of orchid care to be genuinely useful and enough honesty to say plainly when she did not know something and to go find out. She brought reference books. She brought a bag of the specific bark medium that Patrick Garrity had told her the collection needed. She brought food, which Vera accepted without the complicated feelings she might once have had about accepting help, because she had learned in the past several weeks that there was a difference between accepting help as weakness and accepting help as the simple acknowledgement that no one does the important things entirely alone. On a Saturday in early April, while Helen was repotting a section of the collection that had outgrown its containers and Vera was reviewing the hybridization records from the 5th notebook, her phone rang. It was Douglas. He said, been doing some looking into the Aldermoor property. His tone had the careful quality of a man who has discovered he may have missed something and is trying to determine the extent of the oversight before he says anything specific about it. He said he understood she was out at the farmhouse and that he had no objection to that in the short term, that the property was sitting idle anyway and it made sense for someone to be on it. He asked how things were going out there. Vera told him things were going well. He asked if there was anything on the property that she thought the estate needed to be aware of. She said she was still getting a feel for the place and would let him know when she had a complete picture. There was a pause in which Douglas was clearly deciding whether to push further. Then he said, Renata and I might come out and take a look sometime soon, just to see what we're working with. Vera said that would be fine and that she would make sure to have coffee ready. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to the notebook. Helen, who had heard enough of the call to understand its general shape, looked at her from across the staging table with an expression that asked a question without forming one. He's starting to wonder, Vera said. Helen nodded slowly. How much time do you need? Vera considered this. She looked at the orchids on the tables, the ones that were clearly waking, the new growth visible now at the bases of the pseudobulbs, the first tentative signs of what would, in the right conditions, become flowers. Enough time to know what I'm doing before someone tries to tell me what to do with it, she said. That was a reasonable answer. The question was whether she would get it. Patrick Garrity came back in the 2nd week of April. He brought a colleague this time, a woman named Dr. Susan Okafor, who was an orchid taxonomist at a university botanical garden and who had, Patrick had told Vera in advance, been asking to see the collection since he had described it to her. Dr. Okafor was 55, brisk and warm in equal measure, and she moved through the greenhouse with an excitement she clearly had some difficulty containing, which she managed by speaking in the technical language of her field with a speed and density that required Vera to ask her to repeat herself on several occasions. What Dr. Okafor confirmed, with the authority of someone whose professional opinion carried institutional weight, was that several of Margaret Calloway's registered hybrids were of genuine botanical significance. Not merely commercially significant, though they were that too. Botanically significant. The crosses Margaret had made in the 1960s and 1970s had produced varieties with characteristics that were, in the language Dr. Okafor used, not replicated elsewhere in the registered hybrid record. They were one of a kind in the way that careful and skilled work pursued in isolation for 20 years sometimes produces things that would not have emerged any other way. One variety in particular, a cross Margaret had registered in 1977 under the name she had given it, had been the subject of some discussion in orchid collecting circles for years. Collectors had been looking for original stock from Margaret Calloway's greenhouse since the 1990s. They had assumed it was gone. The hybridizer was dead, the land had passed out of direct family management, and no one had ever been able to confirm whether any original plants survived. The plants had survived. They were sitting on a staging table in a sealed greenhouse on the Aldermoor property, 14 miles outside of town, tended now by a woman of 74 who had learned their cultivation requirements from the notebooks of the woman who had created them, a woman she had never met and whose existence she had not known about in any real detail until 5 weeks ago. Dr. Okafor asked if Vera would consider a partnership with the Botanical Garden, a formal arrangement, documented and structured, under which the garden would provide technical support and expertise and access to its network of collectors and institutions, and Vera would maintain ownership of the collection and receive the primary benefit of any commercial or academic arrangements that resulted. Vera said she would like to see the terms in writing before she agreed to anything. Dr. Okafor said that was entirely reasonable and that she would have her institution's legal office prepare a draft within 2 weeks. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table of the farmhouse that was becoming, by degrees, her home, Vera opened her own notebook, the one she had started keeping when she first began reading Margaret's, and wrote for the first time in what she thought of as her own record rather than her notes on someone else's. She wrote about the day she had arrived at the greenhouse, the smell that had come out when the door swung inward. She wrote about the orchids and the notebooks and the letter from the American Orchid Society. She wrote about Patrick Jeridy's face when he came out of the greenhouse after 4 hours and stood in the clearing. She wrote about Raymond, who had known this was here and had not known what to do with it. She thought she understood now, at least partially, why he had locked the door. Margaret's greenhouse had been something outside the boundaries of what Raymond understood as his, something that carried his mother's name and his mother's expertise and his mother's decades of serious work in a field he had no knowledge of. He had been a man who handled things within his understanding and who locked the door on the things outside it. He had not been able to give this to Vera while he was alive, because giving it would have required him to explain it, and explaining it would have required him to understand it, and he never had. So he had left her the key and an apology and let her find her own way to the understanding he had never reached himself. She did not forgive him while she sat there. Forgiveness was not the kind of thing she rushed. But she felt something loosen at the edges of the anger, the way ice loosens at the edges of a frozen thing before the center gives, and she thought that the loosening was probably the beginning of something she would get to eventually, when she was ready. She wrote that down too. On a Tuesday morning in the last week of April, Douglas and Renata drove out to the Aldermoor property. Vera had known they would come. She had made coffee, and she had set out cups, and she had made sure that the farmhouse looked exactly as lived-in and calm as it was, because she was not hiding anything exactly, but she was also not ready to hand it to anyone before she understood all of what it was. They walked through the farmhouse first. Douglas noted the repairs she had made and the cleaning and the general condition of the place with the practiced eye of a man in real estate who cannot stop himself from assessing. Renata said very little and touched nothing, which was her usual approach to places that were not her own. Then Douglas said he would like to see the rest of the property. Vera took them to the greenhouse. She watched Douglas's face when she unlocked the padlock and swung the door open. She watched him take in the size of the structure and the iron framework and the staging tables covered with hundreds of plants. She watched him look at the orchids the way someone looks at something they did not know existed and are now trying to quickly calculate the meaning of. "What is all this?" he said. "Your grandmother's greenhouse," Vera said. "Raymond's mother built it. She spent 20 years working in here. She was a registered orchid hybridizer. Several of her varieties are known in collecting circles." Douglas turned to look at her. His expression had the quality of a man working through arithmetic he has not finished yet. "Mom, how long have you known about this?" "A few weeks," Vera said. "I needed time to understand what I was looking at." "And what are you looking at?" Vera looked at the orchids, at the new growth that was now clearly visible across most of the collection, at the emerging flower spikes on 3 of the plants near the south wall, at the careful and patient evidence of all the years this greenhouse had spent waiting to be found by someone who would know what to do with it. Something that belongs to me, she said. Something that was left to me in the only way Raymond knew how to leave things. Douglas's jaw was tight. The estate attorney should have been informed about any assets on this property. The greenhouse is on the Aldermoor land, Vera said. The Aldermoor land is part of the estate. The estate is in process. I am on the property legally, managing it appropriately, and I am in conversation with a botanist from the university about a formal arrangement. When there is something to report, I will report it. But I am not going to be rushed into decisions about something I have only just begun to understand. She said it the way she had said goodnight on the phone, flat and pleasant and final, and she watched Douglas recognize the tone the same way she suspected he had always recognized it when he was a boy and she used it then, the tone that meant the conversation was done. Renata had drifted to the end of the greenhouse near the workbench. She was looking at the shelves, at the tools and the labeled supplies and the drawers with their ceramic pulls. She opened one drawer and looked inside. There are notebooks in here, she said. Copies, Vera said, without moving. The originals are in the house. I made copies when I started working through them. The originals are quite fragile. This was not entirely accurate. There were, in fact, additional reference materials in several of the drawers, supplementary records Margaret had kept that Vera had not yet fully worked through. The originals were in the farmhouse. The statement was not a lie, but it was not entirely all of the truth either, and Vera felt no particular discomfort about that, because she had learned in 74 years that there was a difference between honesty and handing people weapons before you fully understood what they intended to do with them. Douglas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I want to be kept informed, Mom. This affects the estate. It affects all of us. I'll keep you informed, Vera said, when there's something to tell. They left an hour later, their coffee cups rinsed and stacked neatly in the dish rack, the farmhouse exactly as Vera had arranged it, the greenhouse padlocked behind them as they went. She stood in the meadow and watched the dust from their car settle on the access road after they turned onto the county road and disappeared. The creek was audible from where she stood. The sun was doing something different with the light than it had done in March, a warmer angle, a longer reach. The grass in the meadow was coming in green at the roots. She went back to the greenhouse and unlocked it and stood inside for a while with her hands in her pockets, looking at the orchids the way she had been looking at them for weeks now, which was the way you look at things that are your responsibility and that you are beginning to know well enough to feel the weight of that responsibility as something other than a burden. Then she went to the workbench and opened her own notebook and picked up her pen. She had work to do. The agreement with the Botanical Garden was signed on a Wednesday morning in early May in Dr. Okafor's office at the university, with Patrick Garrity present as an independent witness and Helen sitting in the chair beside Vera because Vera had asked her to come and Helen had not asked why. The terms were what Dr. Okafor had outlined in April. The Botanical Garden would provide technical support, curatorial expertise, and access to its established network of collectors and institutions. Vera retained full ownership of the collection and the greenhouse and the Aldermoor land. Revenue from any sales, loans, or licensing arrangements would flow primarily to her, with a modest percentage to the garden's conservation program. The garden would also undertake, at its own expense, a full condition assessment and professional restoration of the greenhouse structure, repairing the cracked panes and reinforcing the iron framework, and installing a climate monitoring system that would ensure the collection's long-term survival regardless of what the weather outside decided to do. Vera read the agreement twice before she signed it. She asked 2 questions that her own reading of the document had raised. She received clear answers to both. Then she signed. On the drive back to the Aldermoor property, Helen did not say anything for the first several miles. Then she said, quietly and without ceremony, Raymond had no idea what he was sitting on. No, Vera said. He didn't. Neither did Douglas. Neither did Douglas, Vera agreed. Helen looked out the window at the passing fields, the green coming fully in now, the trees fully leaved, the countryside doing what it does every May as though it has never done it before and is slightly surprised by its own capability. After a moment, she said, Margaret would have liked you, I think. Vera considered this. She thought about the handwriting in the notebooks, small and precise, and written with the particular confidence of someone who knew what they were recording mattered. She thought about the letter from the American Orchid Society, The formal confirmation of something Margaret had clearly known was true long before any institution told her so. "I think I would have liked her," she said. The first flowers opened in the third week of May. It was the variety from the 1977 registration, the one that collectors had been looking for since the 1990s, the one that Dr. Okafor had described with an excitement she had difficulty containing. Vera had been watching the spike develop for 2 weeks, checking it each morning the way you check on something you have been entrusted with and do not want to fail. The spike had risen slowly, the buds forming at intervals along its length, and then on a Tuesday morning with the sun coming through the newly cleaned glass in long, clean columns, the first bud opened. She sat on the stool she had brought from the farmhouse and put in the greenhouse for exactly this kind of occasion, and she looked at the flower for a long time without taking a photograph or calling anyone or doing anything at all except looking at it. Margaret had made this, had crossed 2 species with deliberate care, and waited through the years it took for the crossing to produce something new, and had done it again and again until the result was this specific flower, in this specific color, with this specific configuration of petals that had not existed in the world before Margaret Calloway decided to make it exist. And then Margaret had died, and Raymond had locked the door, and the plant had waited in the cold and the dark for decades. And then Vera had turned a key and walked in and read the notebooks and learned what she needed to know. And here was the flower. It was, she thought, a very patient flower. She called Dr. Okafor. She took photographs. She called Helen, who drove out that afternoon and stood in the greenhouse with her hands clasped in front of her and said nothing for a long while, which was the right response. Patrick Garrity sent the photographs to 3 collectors he had already been in contact with regarding the collection. All 3 responded within 48 hours. One of them, a collector in Portland who had been looking for original Calloway stock since 2003, sent a written offer for a division of the flowering plant within 24 hours of receiving the photographs. The offer was formal and serious, and the number in it was the kind of number that Vera read and then set down on the kitchen table of the farmhouse and walked away from for a few minutes before coming back to read again. She did not accept the first offer. Patrick had told her not to, and she had enough sense to understand why. Instead, she let him manage the process the way he managed these things, with the patience and the professional distance of someone who understood the market and was not personally attached to any particular outcome except the correct one. The correct one arrived 6 weeks later, after a process that Patrick described as competitive interest, which was his careful language for the situation of multiple serious collectors wanting the same rare thing at the same time. The final arrangement was not a simple sale. It was a structured agreement under which Vera provided documented divisions of several of the registered varieties to a network of 4 collectors and 1 botanical institution, retaining the original mother plants and the full provenance documentation, and receiving in return a sum that she wrote down in her own notebook in her own handwriting and then looked at for a while before she closed the notebook and went to start dinner. It was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of enough that reorganized the arithmetic of a life that had been headed, 6 months ago, toward a 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. She called her bank on a Monday morning and had a conversation she had not expected to have at 74 years old, the conversation of a woman with options rather than the conversation of a woman in the process of running out of them. The banker, a young man who had previously spoken to her with the careful gentleness reserved for elderly customers managing fixed incomes, adjusted his tone partway through the call in a way that Vera found quietly satisfying. She called her own attorney that same afternoon. Not the estate attorney Douglas used, but a different one, a woman in her 50s named Carol Briggs who had been recommended by Dr. Okafor and who asked sharp questions and listened to the answers with an attention that made Vera feel, for the first time in a long time, that the person across the table was working entirely for her interests and for no one else's. Carol Briggs said the question of the Aldermoor property within the estate needed to be examined carefully. She said that the restructuring Raymond had undertaken in his final year, while technically legal as structured, had some characteristics that a court might find worth examining more closely, particularly given the circumstances under which certain documents had been signed and the degree to which the surviving spouse had been involved in or informed about those decisions. Vera said she did not want to fight a long legal battle. Carol said she understood that, and that the goal was not a battle but a negotiation conducted from a position of strength rather than desperation. She said there was a difference, and that Vera was no longer in the position she had been in when Douglas and Renata had slid a folder across a kitchen table and told her she had a week. Vera thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "What do I need to do?" The conversation with Douglas happened on a Saturday in late June. Vera asked him to come to the farmhouse alone, without Renata, which he did with a wariness that told her he understood something had shifted even if he did not yet know exactly what. She had the table set with coffee and the coffee cake Helen had brought the day before, because Vera was not interested in theater. She was interested in clarity, and clarity did not require an empty table or a cold room. She told him about the Botanical Garden agreement. She told him about the collection's assessed value and the arrangements Patrick had structured. She did not tell him the specific numbers, not yet, but she told him enough that Douglas's expression moved through several phases: the calculation phase, and the reassessment phase, and finally a phase that looked something like what she could only describe as the specific discomfort of a man who has badly underestimated something and knows it. She told him that Carol Briggs was reviewing the estate structure and that there were aspects of Raymond's final year arrangements that Carol believed warranted a closer look. Douglas said, "Mom, I want you to know that we were trying to do what was right for the estate. For all of us." Vera looked at him across the table, her son, who she had sat beside at kitchen tables for 47 years. She looked at him the way you look at someone you love and are also clear-eyed about, which is one of the harder kinds of looking. "You told me I had a week," she said. "You had already sold the house before you sat down to tell me. You brought Renata to that conversation as though you needed a witness or a barrier. I was never sure which. And you said I didn't work, Boyd. You said your father built everything." Douglas's face changed. The calculation left it. What replaced it was something more uncomfortable and more honest. The face of a man hearing something true that he would prefer not to be true. "I said Douglas," she corrected gently, because she had misspoken and she was not going to let a misstatement stand even now. "You said it, and you meant it, and I have thought about it every day since." A long silence. "I know," he said finally. His voice was different from the voice he had used in the farmhouse kitchen in February. Smaller. "I know I said it." The silence extended between them, not hostile, but not comfortable either. The creak was audible through the open window. The coffee sat between them going warm. "Here is what I want," Vera said. "I want the Aldermoor land transferred into my name outright as part of the estate settlement. I want Carol and your estate attorney to sit down together and find the arrangement that accomplishes that without a court process, if at all possible. I want to stay in this farmhouse, and I want to continue the work I have started here. And I want you to know that I am willing to have a relationship with you, Douglas, a real one. But it will have to be built on something more honest than what we have been operating on." Douglas looked at his hands around his coffee cup. Then he said, "And if I'd found the greenhouse first?" She knew what he was really asking. Whether she thought he would have done to Margaret's collection what he had done to the house, handled it, transferred it, reduced it to a line item in a spreadsheet managed by an estate attorney who had not known to look for it. She did not answer that question directly. She said, "It doesn't matter who found it. I found it, and I knew what to do with it because I took the time to learn what I was looking at before I decided anything." He left 2 hours later with Carol Briggs's contact information and an expression that she recognized from when he was a boy and had done something he knew was wrong and had been caught in it. Not the defiance of someone refusing to acknowledge the wrong, but the quieter and harder look of someone sitting with it. She did not feel victorious when his car turned onto the county road and disappeared. She felt tired in the way that honest conversations make you tired, the good tiredness of having said the true thing rather than the easy thing. She went to the greenhouse. The settlement took 11 weeks. There were several conversations between Carol Briggs and Douglas's estate attorney that Vera was not party to and did not need to be, because that was what having your own attorney meant, that you did not have to be in every room where your interests were being discussed. Carol kept her informed with the regularity and clarity of someone who understood that her client was not fragile and did not need information managed, only conveyed accurately. The final agreement transferred the Aldermoor property, the farmhouse, and the greenhouse into Vera's name outright. There was an additional settlement figure that accounted for the restructuring of Raymond's estate, a figure that Carol described as fair given the circumstances and that Vera thought of simply as the acknowledgement that 46 years of careful and invisible labor had, in the end, been worth something that could be put in writing. She signed the final documents on a Thursday morning in Carol's office. Then she drove back to the Aldermoor property on a clear September day with the windows down and the first cool edge of autumn in the air, and she pulled into the lane and parked in the meadow and got out and stood in the grass that was hers now, unambiguously and entirely hers, and listened to the creek. The greenhouse restoration had been completed the previous month. The Botanical Gardens team had spent 3 weeks on it, replacing the broken panes, reinforcing the iron, installing the climate monitoring system, repointing the stonework at the base of the structure. It looked, when they were finished, as it must have looked when Margaret first built it, or was given it, or found it. Solid and purposeful and built to last. The glass was clean and the iron was clean and the interior light had the quality that good greenhouse glass produces, warm and diffuse and generous. Vera had added her own things to the interior over the months. A second stool at the workbench beside the one she already had, because Helen came often enough to warrant it. A small shelf above the workbench with her own notebooks in chronological order beside Margaret's. The 2 sets of records and conversation now in a way that felt right. A photograph of Margaret that Dr. Okafor had found in the Botanical Gardens archive, taken in the 1970s, a woman in her 50s with a direct and unsmiling expression that managed to convey warmth anyway, standing in what was recognizably this greenhouse, with the orchids behind her and the iron framework above her and the particular quality of this specific light. Vera had framed it and put it on the shelf above the workbench where Margaret could see the work continuing. Helen had started her own hybridization project, a modest and carefully considered one, using 2 of the varieties from the collection as parent plants. She came on Tuesdays and Saturdays and kept her own section of the staging tables with her own records in her own notebook. She and Vera worked together in the greenhouse in a companionable silence that had the quality of something they had both, without discussing it, decided was one of the better things in their lives. Patrick Garrity had connected Vera with a small network of other collectors and growers who were doing similar work, serious amateur and professional hybridizers scattered across the country, who communicated through a newsletter and an annual gathering that Vera had agreed to attend the following spring. Several of them had written to her after Patrick shared the story of the collection, letters that were warm and specific and that asked botanical questions she was, increasingly, able to answer. She answered each one in her own handwriting, at the kitchen table of the farmhouse, in the evenings after the greenhouse work was done. She was, she thought, becoming someone she had not known she was going to become. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of stories that resolve into declarations. In the quiet and accumulating way of a person who has found the work that fits the shape of what they actually know and are and can do, and who is doing it, daily, without requiring anyone else to confirm that it is worth doing. Douglas called on a Sunday in October. He called the way he had been calling in the months since the conversation at the farmhouse kitchen table, without an agenda, without the careful flatness of a man delivering prepared language. He asked how the greenhouse was doing. She told him about the second flowering cycle, the 3 new spikes developing on the south staging table, the variety that had surprised her by re-blooming ahead of its documented schedule. He listened with what sounded like genuine interest, or at least genuine effort, which she understood was not the same thing yet, but could become at given time. Before he hung up, he said, "I'm glad you found it, Mom. The greenhouse. I'm glad it was you." She thought about that after the call ended. She thought about what it meant for him to say it, how much it had probably cost him, how true it was regardless of the cost. She went to her notebook and wrote it down. Not because she needed to record it as evidence of anything, but because it was the kind of thing that deserved to be written down. The kind of thing you want to be able to return to. On the last warm evening of October, she sat on the step of the greenhouse as the light left the meadow in the way that light leaves meadows in the fall, gradually and then all at once, the colors going from gold to amber to the particular blue-gray of early dusk. The creek was running at its autumn level, higher than summer, purposeful. The farmhouse windows were lit from inside, warm against the cooling air. She thought about the morning in the house on Crestview Lane, the magnolias blooming outside the kitchen window, the folder with the shell-pink fingernails. She thought about driving out to the Aldermoor property for the first time with the key in her jacket pocket and the thermos of coffee on the seat beside her, and no clear idea of what she was driving toward. She thought about the moment the greenhouse door had swung inward, and the smell of old green had come out to meet her, 40 years of sealed and patient life exhaled in a single breath. She thought about Raymond, who had not been able to give her this while he was alive and had done his incomplete and complicated best to leave it to her when he was gone. She thought about Margaret, who had made something extraordinary and had not lived to see it found by someone who would know what to do with it, who had trusted, perhaps, that someone eventually would. She thought about the flower that had opened on that Tuesday morning in May, the one she had sat in front of on the stool for a long time without doing anything except looking at it. She thought about what it meant to be 74 years old and to be at the beginning of something. Not the end, not the quiet maintenance of a life already fully formed, but an actual beginning, with actual work ahead of her and actual things to learn and actual relationships to build with people who spoke to her as someone whose knowledge mattered and whose presence in the room changed what the room could accomplish. She had not expected this. She had not known to expect it. That was the part she kept returning to, the part that still surprised her each time she thought about it, that she had been 73 years old and standing at a kitchen table being handed a 30-day notice, and that none of what came after had been visible from that moment. None of the notebooks and none of the orchids and none of the conversations with Dr. Okafor or the agreement with the Botanical Garden or the final documents in Carol Briggs's office or the Sunday calls from Douglas or the Tuesday mornings working alongside Helen in the greenhouse that smelled of green and iron and the accumulated decades of a woman she was still, slowly, coming to know. None of it had been visible. It had all been on the other side of a padlocked door that she had a key to and had not yet used. She went inside as the last light left the meadow, and she put the kettle on, and she opened her notebook to the next blank page, and she picked up her pen. There was still work to do, and she intended to do it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.